So, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ellen Mutter, and I'm the Arts Coordinator for the Arts at Amherst Initiative. And on behalf of the steering committee, I'm thrilled to be welcoming you all this evening. As we were saying, I wish I could be welcoming you into the Bailey Brown house with a plate of macaroni and cheese and some brownies from Atkins, but I'll just instead encourage you to find comfort in your own spaces, drink a beer, get up as needed, whip up your own batch of brownies, whatever makes you feel comfortable, and feel free to have your camera on or off. I know how difficult it can be to tune in to these events at the end of the day, so I want to thank you for coming out tonight and making time to show up. The intent of this evening's conversation is to create a safe and supportive space where everyone can learn and grow, and I want to encourage you all to share questions and resources and ideas in the chat throughout tonight's conversation, although we will make time specifically at the end for Q&A. A heads up that the event is currently being recorded and will be posted on our website for those that can't attend live. And now I'm happy to introduce our speakers this evening. First, we have Dwight Carey.
Hi.
Thank you. He's an assistant professor of art and the history of art, and his research examines the physical architectures of slavery in Mauritius. Dwight is also a member of the Arts at Amherst Initiative Steering Committee. Our second speaker is Anna Carneiro, and she's a visiting playwright for the Theater and Dance Department who has published works in Italian and Portuguese, as well as English, on the topics of social justice, globalization, and immigration. Our third speaker is Amy Coddington. Hi, Amy. She's assistant professor of music, and her research investigates how the commercial radio industry influences musical expression. And then finally, Daryl Harper, our moderator of tonight's conversation. Daryl is the associate professor of music and director of the CHI. His research explores how race, culture, and the political economy intersect with music. And Daryl is also a member of the steering committee for the Arts at Amherst Initiative. And I'm now happy to hand off to him to start tonight's conversation.
Thanks, Ellen. Appreciate it. And I'll add my welcome to everyone. It's great to see all of you. So we're going to start out with just kind of an introduction of each of our panelists' research. I've asked them to each speak for about 5 minutes about how their research questions address the issue of race or confront the issue of race. And before we get into that, I want to just quickly recognize the other members on the committee with Dwight and Ellen and me, Danielle, Amadeo, and Jenna Regal. So thank you all for helping to organize this, and it's great steering committee to be a part of. So I thought, Amy, we'd start with you tonight. Can you just tell us about your research, give us some more details, and help orient us to the things you're thinking about?
Sure. I just want to say thanks everyone for joining us in this conversation. I'm really delighted to engage with all of you and have the opportunity to learn from all of the other people in this space. So at the heart of my research is the question of how commodification of musical experience relates to the politics of race in the United States, how the structure and form of the music industry impacts our understandings of ourselves and of others. So my central research project investigates the racial politics of hip-hop's rise from a Bronx-based minority subculture into the most popular genre in the United States, not to mention the world. A rise that, at its most basic, requires that artists participate in the music industry, which is to this day still an openly segregated industry, one in which an artist's racial identity significantly factors into how they're treated by the industry. The deals they sign, the style of music they release, what radio stations play their music, promotional strategies, what Spotify playlists they appear on, et cetera, et cetera. This project in some way actually grows out of my own experience as a white woman who grew up in a very white town in a very white state, who, like every other white kid at her school, soundtracked her teenage years with hip hop, blind to any sense of the racial politics associated with it. In some ways, my research tries to answer the question of how this experience was possible, how the genre's radical political potential and its ability to create spaces for marginalized people of color to speak truth to power was quieted and hushed to make way for white audiences like myself to buy the music. Specifically, my book manuscript focuses on hip hop's relationship to the commercial radio industry. In my work, I think about the commercial radio industry as producing and articulating American racial identity by broadcasting certain styles of music to specific racially defined audiences, creating and replicating an understanding of what people listen to what genres. Radio programming, in my research, I think of it as a racial product or a racial project, a way of representing and organizing people and social structures that Michael Omi and Howard Winnett argue is a central agent in creating and maintaining racial categories. So the precise details of how hip hop made its way onto the radio in my work, I'd like to think it offers insight into a larger story about how hip hop and Black culture more generally intersect with capitalism and institutions pushing in the 1990s ideas like liberal multiculturalism to in some ways neutralize the potential for radical critique within the culture. I think I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to all of your questions.
Thanks, Amy. Dwight, could you share your research with us, please?
Yeah, so I work on, I'm writing a book right now on Mauritius, which is an island in the Western Indian Ocean, about 400 miles east of Madagascar. And so the thing about Mauritius is that really, I mean, I guess I could explain a bit of the background for why I'm writing the book that I'm writing. Mauritius is a place where race, as we understand it in the United States, doesn't really exist so much as ethnicity is more of the metric that people use to classify themselves. So basically, Mauritius is an island where 29% of the population descend from slaves, slaves who are from Madagascar, East Africa, West Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. And about 70% of the population descends from people who were indentured laborers who were brought to the island by the British after slavery ended. And those indentured laborers, yeah, they came from India largely. About 2% of the Mauritian population is white, and they descend from French slave owners of the 18th century, and 2% of the Mauritian population is Chinese. But things get even more complicated because the 1968 Constitution of Mauritius, you know, that was ratified when the island became an independent nation, classifies all citizens of Mauritius for purposes of governmental documentation, even for purposes of representation in parliament. All Mauritian citizens are either classified as Hindu, Muslim, Chinese, or members of the general population. General population is a term that describes both white people who are descendants of slave owners and Creole people who are descendants of slaves. So just to understand how odd this would be, basically it would be as if, according to the United States government, both African American people and white people were considered the same ethnic group for all purposes of government classification, everything involving, you know, government outreach and stuff like that. Basically, this situation has created a context in Mauritius in which people who are descendants of slaves don't have official recognition in, by the government. It becomes very hard for Creole people. Creole is the term for people who are descendants of slaves locally, to petition the government for social services and such. And one of the issues that comes up, actually, Creoles are the most impoverished population on the island. But general population, the ethnic group that they belong to, is actually the wealthiest ethnic group, in no small part because of the 2% of the population, of the general population that is white, who descend from French slave owners. And these families in Mauritius, a lot of them owned beachfront property that they inherited from plantations, and then they sold them to multinational resort chains in the 1970s and made millions of dollars off of doing so. But the thing is that basically in Mauritius, because of this non-recognition of Creoles, these people, you know, are the most impoverished ethnic group. And there's this stereotype called le Malaise Creole, or the Creole Malaise, that basically argues that Creole people don't know who they really are. They don't know who their ancestors are. They were basically, you know, there's the trauma of slavery that has debilitated them. And so that explains why, you know, you find things, you know, like poverty in Creole communities. Basically, my book tries to intervene in this dilemma, this issue, and actually the United Nations has said that Mauritius needs to change its constitution. That's not happening because the country is dealing with an oil spill right now, and also COVID. But in any case, my book tries to intervene in this conflict by saying, well, Creole people actually do know who they are, actually have this history to be proud of. Creole people, these descendants of slaves, are actually a population that is the indigenous population of an island that officially and technically has no indigenous population at all. My book basically argues that through their labor in construction as slaves who were tasked with building buildings, these people, these Creole slaves brought from all of these places, they rooted themselves on the island. They developed a knowledge of this land that no one else in world history ever possessed. And they developed a knowledge of these resources and how to turn them into an architecture, which made the whole feat of settling this remote, uninhabited island with no indigenous group possible. And so that's what it means to be Creole in Mauritius, is to descend from this people that performed this feat. So that's kind of a general description of, or rundown of Mauritian history in my book. So yeah, it fits into this ethnic conversation rather than a racial one.
Thanks, Dwight. And Anna?
Hi, everybody. It's good to be with you. So I consider myself more of an artist, though I do have some works and I'm working on a book called Global Playwriting Workbook. But I see that my work really comes out of my artistic practice and also my community engagement practice with my theater company called Babel Theater Project, which works with immigrant communities in the greater Boston area. So about my book, it's about teaching playwriting from a global perspective. And I've been interviewing makers from all over the world about, you know, what is a good play and how do we teach writers to write good plays, or, you know. And as you will notice, I was confronted since the beginning with questions of race and let's say and with discontinuities around, you know, ideas of what is good and what is bad, and what should we be teaching, can we even teach. And so I really, after interviewing a lot of people, I decided that I do have to add a chapter that really discusses those issues around race and privilege and the disparities between the North, the global North, and the global South that are embedded, because often what the playwrights were telling me came often from what I would call an ethnocentric view. So everybody was thinking from their cultural perspective, you know, and was really rare to find someone who could actually really have what I would call ethno-relative view of the subject. So so it's really, I think it became central to my work as it evolved to question the ideas that are often that have shaped Western theater, you know, that have been taught, and I have been shaped by them, you know, as a Latina playwright. Uh, so how can we redefine playwriting and the teaching of playwriting without reinforcing whiteness, you know, has been really central to my most recent questioning. Um, and um, and really my goal with my work is to develop this cultural self-awareness, cultural and racial self-awareness, because race is culture, and through transcultural dialogue. So through meeting what is considered other or different, or is that when we can really hold in ourselves the paradox of what is us and what is not us, is that when we can really arrive to, let's say, a most effective and what people love to call global, you know, type of teaching and of artistic practice. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Can I actually start with you for my first question? I wonder if you could share your comments. Make me think of what I think is your first play. Is that correct? All is Filthy in Wonderland.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could tell us about the play, and also something else you said. You kind of apologized for being an artist. I want to let you know you don't need to do that here. We're good with that, and in that light, if you would talk about your research process in regard to your playwriting and that project in particular, and how that project's put together.
Sure. So that was actually my very first play. So, and I would say that I am, you know, I'm an immigrant writer, and I'm a multilingual writer. So, and I was born as a writer for the theater, in this context of displacement. So this has really shaped and continues to shape the way that I make work and the way that I do creative research for my work, if you want. So that project in particular was let's say, like brew for many years, but it was a result of my undocumented immigrant experience in Italy, and like there were really difficult conditions for immigrants there, and there are those, you know, what like those center for immigrants that would enclose them, and there were, you know, a lot of violences happening there. There was a lot of violence, and so this play is about two Brazilian immigrants in that context, and it's a work play that works with bilingualism. So I weave that, like the foreign language, to create this effect in the audience that most probably won't know Portuguese, like to have the effect of, okay, if I arrive into a foreign land, a foreign country where I'm not welcome, how do I feel as audience, when I don't understand a language, and what can I understand out of this play? So that was my first work that was very, let's say, culturally localized. And then other works evolved from that. And but always, I would say that the themes of race and colonialism are always there. Um, and yeah.
Thank you. I want to ask the same question for Dwight and for Amy. One of the things that strikes me in your work is how you engage the issue of race through capitalism or the commodification of bodies or labor, and that thread running throughout your work of using the lens of the commodity in order to get to the information you want. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that, and Dwight, in your case, maybe share a little bit about the research method that I read about. You were getting these documents about kind of the cost ledgers. If you could share that and talk about the larger issue of commodity, and then pass on to Amy.
So basically, what Daryl is talking about is, my broader method, which I think is kind of, it's almost like the method of a historian more so than an architectural historian traditionally. But basically, what I'm trying to do in my book is that, and I'm looking at, or I'm trying to reconstruct this history that of Mauritius with a particular eye to the specific kinds of knowledge of the land and of material resources used in construction that slaves possessed. So in Mauritius, most of the buildings that date from the 18th and 19th century, the buildings that slaves built were made of local basalt deposits or made from coral-based mortars. Also, wood was used quite heavily, not just as a kind of framework for buildings, but also to, people collected wood so that they could then burn the wood and then use that to melt down coral into a lime wash that could be used in working with stone blocks. The thing is that, what I've done in order to reconstruct or think about what would slaves have known in their head about the land, about how to work these resources, is that I've gone into records on the sale of buildings, particularly how much it cost, the records that detail how much it actually costs to build certain buildings, because what's interesting about those records is that they won't tell you much about what buildings actually looked like, but they will tell you, how many laborers were involved in the project, what these laborers did. Maybe they'll say something like, okay, someone was a master mason or a master coral smith. It might even give you some information on that's even praises a certain slave for their skill. And it tells you about how much all of these things cost to actually put together. And so I started using those records to glean more information about enslaved knowledge. And I've also started taking samples from actual buildings that exist in Mauritius from this period. There are only about 7 of them on the island still. But I've been testing those remnants for their chemical and material composition. I've been doing that work with Peter Crowley, who's a geology professor. And so it's, I'm trying to basically use this scientific approach and this approach from cost logs to develop this idea, or just get an idea of what slaves actually knew and how much they knew, what they did and what they did. So it's like piecing together, because, you know, these are people who weren't seen as valuable or smart or important, but, or well, they were seen as valuable only as commodities themselves. But, you know, I think that kind of interdisciplinary approach, I've really enjoyed using it because of the way in which it can bring you in unexpected or push you in unexpected directions.
Thanks, Dwight. Amy?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit similar to Dwight, my approach to thinking about commodities is dependent upon, I mean, it's different than Dwight, because it's not necessarily the absence of sort of historical records of, you know, what people were doing, but an absence of any sense of what listeners make of music, and, or, you know, try a general sense of how listeners and artists use music as a way to sort of craft their own identities and to represent their own racial identities. Lots of scholars have written about this. It's not that there's an absence of this, but for my work, I found it more compelling to think about music as a commodity, because the way that, right, the way that advertisers advertise commodities can reveal a lot about who its intended audience is, regardless of whether it's actually sort of hitting those audiences. But I think, like Dwight, the record of actual, you know, sales and how things are sold and who they're sold to and what's working and what's not in these like business practices is actually far more, there's a far better historical record of that than there is of individual listeners making sense of their own world. And so for me, thinking about commodification allows me to think about on a large scale how sort of, you know, top down people are making sense of the world. And of course there's this entire other sense of bottom up, right? What are, you know, what are listeners and musicians, how are they interacting with these texts? And, you know, there's some historical, you have some records of that, right? So radio programmers oftentimes will play something that they think their audience is going to love, and then they, you know, all the white women decide they hate that, and so they can't play it anymore, right? So you get some sense of this from the record, but really looking at it as a commodity helps give a little more historical granular detail.
Thank you. So I'm seeing some questions starting to come up in the chat, and I'm keeping track. Anika Henderson has asked a question. I want to remind everyone that it's also fine to raise your hand on screen or use the raise hand feature, whichever you prefer. If you write your question in the chat, I'll read it. I'll assume that you want it read. If you raise your hand or use the raise hand feature, I'll assume you want to speak. But before we get to the Q&A, I want to invite the panelists to interact with one another and ask any questions that they might have of each other about the what you've just heard, or things I've always wanted to ask Anna this question, you know, anything like that.
Anna, I'll ask you a question that's a little bit like, I'm just very curious based on my own research. So writing, in your sort of experience as a playwright who writes in, you know, many languages, how do you sell these things, right? How do you cultivate audiences to come to these plays, and you know, how do you create spaces for this specific kind of group of language speakers?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, for the type of work that I do, I have to self-produce. I cannot rely on a system or an industry, especially, you know, in America, that has set certain canons for the theater, you know. So this is a reality that I had to come to terms with as a woman of color, you know, as an immigrant, now 20 years. first in Europe, now here. It does not change that much, actually. So I think it's really about deciding what you want to do with your work, you know. And for me, like the artistic research that I do, I think happens in a couple levels. And one is the formal one, you know, when I write plays, and then when I'm questioning the dramatic form, because the dramatic form was shaped by whiteness. And through that, through this type of deconstruction and using like multilingualism, but then is an art that paradoxically is not an art for the masses, you know. And then the other one is the work that I do with the Babel Theater Project with communities, which is more me as sort of a dramaturg or cultural organizer or facilitator, helping, you know, immigrant voices. I don't really like the word help, but like, you know, like to create space for immigrant voices to emerge, you know, and make art within those communities, but trying also to build bridges so that the experiences do not remain insulated. So, but that is, you know, the question of the commodity here, you know, like where is the money? You know, the money, it's not the big industry money, you know. So actually, my question for you would be, how do you see, like, for example, a product or a work of art like Hamilton, for example? Do you have you?
I mean, I think Hamilton, this is, you know, this is going to reveal a lot about the way that I think about music, but I think of Hamilton as just as much of a commodity as, you know, Britney Spears, as any, you know, any sort of other popular music release. You know, Hamilton had the best-selling album for many, many weeks. You know, the shows cost a lot of money. There's a lot of capital being created through this project. And so, of course, it's a work of art, right? I think most musicians consider their work to be works of art, even if they're selling them within a pretty, you know, strict commodity system.
Thank you both. We're getting some questions from the audience, so let me start with Anika's question. Anika Henderson asks, she says, "Hello everyone, my question's for Amy. I want to know if she thinks we should be thinking of hip-hop music as pop music now, as it has gained a mainstream audience." Next question is for you, Dwight, if you see it there.
Hi, Anika. This is such a great question. So historically, the music industry has designated pop to sort of be this de facto white northern in the early part of the 20th century. It really didn't apply to music coming out of the South at all. A category for white people making music for other white people in the North. And that designation has largely stayed the same. I would love for hip hop to be thought of as pop music. It is the most influential genre by far. If you listen to anything on pop radio, if you listen to anything on country radio, if you listen to rock radio these days, all of this music is really influenced by sampling, by beat production, by any sort of, by many musical elements embedded, you know, that are part of hip hop. That said, I do think that you know, allowing there to be, right, a word like hip hop which says something different about the music than pop, right? This is a question of carving out space for people to kind of construct their own musical identities and find places where they can, you know, exchange ideas with other creators that think about their music the same way. I think if you were to ask artists like KRS-One or Afrika Bambaataa, artists who were really central in the kind of beginnings of hip hop, they would probably say, we don't want to call hip hop pop now because hip hop has a really specific meaning. So great question. There's no easy answer.
Thanks. Anika?
I was just going to say thank you for that, Amy. I was wondering if that was the argument your project was making, or if that was something that you were engaging.
Yeah, so part of it is, right, how does hip hop become part of this kind of pop apparatus by appearing on Top 40 radio, which are pop stations? But then the other side of it is, of course, the hip hop community responding to hip hop becoming mainstream and trying to kind of disentangle themselves with things that are going too far to the pop side.
Thank you.
Yep. So this question is from Karen Kohler to Dwight. Karen says, I've always wanted to ask Dwight, how do you see your methodology in relationship to archaeology?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think it's something that's really relevant, right? I mean, it's something to think about. And what I can say is that, I think that in many respects, the method that I'm using, especially the sample collection, it interfaces with archaeology to an extent, but where I see myself diverging from the archaeological and really being roped in more to the architectural historical is that basically what I'm doing is taking samples from buildings that still stand in some way, shape, or form. So basically, and the reason why I'm doing that is because I'm particularly interested in how these rare examples of buildings that still remain, I want to know, well, why do these buildings still exist? What is it about them that has caused them to, stand for so long on an island in which most buildings that were built at this time, right, in this 18th and 19th century fell down? Mauritius, like pretty much all of these slave societies in the Caribbean, or well, not necessarily all of them, but Mauritius really has a history of shoddy construction, buildings made quickly, very, hastily. But I'm interested in these buildings that still remain and how they speak to this broader mastery of labor. And I also think that buildings that do not stand can still speak to this mastery of material and of landscape. But where I see myself diverging from archaeology is basically in my preference for the buildings that still are intact in some way. So, what I'm not doing is, excavating these sites. But I do think that is a project that, it's related, but I think that is something that would lead into the realm more of material culture studies and such. So yeah, thank you for that question. And, I had a question for Amy, actually. And, I don't know if it disrupts the flow to ask it, but I wonder, to what it's related to Anika's question, to what extent do you see the fact that, I believe I read somewhere that like more white people listen to hip hop than Black people. How does that affect the way in which hip hop, in your view, is a part of a Black identity now? Or how do Black people, in your view, relate to hip hop now that it's so mainstream and that, it's no longer like seen as, like what would be called Black music or something?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a complete answer for it. In part because I think that people relate to music in a variety of different ways. I do think if you look at kind of the structure of the record industry and the structure of the radio industry and the structure of things like Spotify or Apple Music, right, streaming services, YouTube, any of these ways that people are accessing music, hip hop is still largely understood as Black music. It gets placed in Black or urban divisions of record labels. It gets played on urban radio stations, which is a term that it means basically Black music for Black people. Although that's a overgeneralization, I should add, but. How people consider, how people's own relationship with hip hop, that's a question I'm not quite, I don't think I'm told. My research actually really doesn't equip me to answer that question, but instead what I can say is that the industries involved still really do identify hip hop as Black music, despite the fact that, of course, there's more non-Black listeners than there are Black listeners listening to hip hop on a daily basis throughout the world.
We have a question from Sarah Stouterman. This is for Anna. At UMass Amherst for about 30 years, there was a forum called New World Theater. I remember New World Theater, founded by Roberta Uno, that brought dramas to the 5 colleges written to and about and for creating space for voices of immigrants and BIPOC and so forth. Is there such a thing in the Amherst area now?
Not that I know of, but I've been here in the Amherst area for only 1 year. So, so I don't know if I'm the best person to answer to this. I'd love to know. And I would love to do these things in this area, you know, as I continue to be here. I think, you know, I think it's really important for me. I think this has been really important for me because it was I think if I look back at my, you know, like trajectory as an artist, you know, it was a slow like realization about, you know, how easy it is, and that especially when I was living in Europe, how easy it is for the main culture and the culture that is like dominating to talk about immigrants, and how like others are given space to talk about, you know, the ones that are otherized. But it's very hard to make real space for the otherized or the marginalized to actually make their art, you know. So I think I felt this throughout my life, and that's why I feel I have a commitment also to keep doing this, not just for myself, but for, you know, the communities that I feel connected to.
Thank you. Ezekiel Baskin.
Hi. I had a question also for Anna. This is sort of a pedagogical question. What are sort of tools and methods you use in the classroom teaching playwriting to sort of help break apart the sort of idea of what makes a good play as sort of created by the canon? And how do you encourage students to sort of move beyond that framework for thinking about their own work and sort of thinking about the theater that you're talking about or sort of examining in the classroom?
Yeah, so so I try to really make the students not give a framework before, you know, not give a how-to, but to give some prompts that will like facilitate an emergence of the students' contents, you know, and the students' ideas of or instincts about what theater is. And I'm saying theater and not drama. So after, according to what I see emerge, you know, like then we have conversations in the classrooms, and for me, it's really important. Like the first thing for me is to differentiate that, you know, performance theater and drama are not synonymous, like they're different things, you know. So drama is a smaller portion of that, and we can make theater without like using the dramatic writing. So I always try to, like, whenever something emerges, and if we're talking about dramatic writing, because, you know, that is part of writing, then I always try to place that. So let's remember that this is, you know, like that is more into the canon, but we don't have to use the canon. we may use the canon, we have the choice, we can also do other things. So really, for me, it's about showing as many different choices as I can to the students through exercises and through readings, and really breaking a lot of preconceived ideas, because they come with preconceived ideas, and breaking those down so that they can then really create from a place of freedom. Sorry, I talked so much.
Thanks. We have another question from Anika for Amy. Anika says, I want to say thank you to the organizers for putting this together. This is great. My question is for Amy. I'm fascinated by the idea that hip-hop's move into the mainstream expanded the possibilities for how artists sounded their racial identities. Can you say more about how this move to the mainstream expanded rather than restricted the way in which artists articulated their racial identities?
This is such a great question. Thank you. I'd say easy answer maybe is that with fame comes more freedom in the music industry, right? So success begets more success, and right, that's a sort of easy answer. I think the harder thing to disentangle is that hip hop's rise to the mainstream is happening as sort of a as access to different styles of music is increasing due to the internet, right? So you might say now that that, you know, there's an argument to be made that because of things like Spotify, like a sense of a global jukebox, people have access to all sorts of different music, and that influences the way that they, you know, make their artistic products, whether that's, you know, Drake taking every single type of music, you know, sort of incorporating all these smaller subcultural styles of music that are from across the globe, or what, you know, whether that's other artists simply, you know, engaging in a little bit more genre mixing, right, stylistic mixing. The increased access and the decrease of gatekeepers who are really trying to keep people within their lanes, which happens as the music industry decreases in its influence throughout the 1990s as the internet grows. You know, Napster comes up, iTunes comes and sort of saves the day, and now we have streaming services. It's hard to disentangle a sense of artistic freedom coming from access to resources that you might get if you're a more mainstream artist, or simply given a kind of longer leash by record companies with a huge, I would say, like music industry, musician wise sense that there's just access to more things and more influences are possible.
Thank you.
Amy, you actually, all three of you have alluded to it a little bit in speaking about your research, but I guess coming from theater and dance, I'm really interested in your personal stories. And so kind of hearing more about how your racial identity influenced or directed you towards your area of research. Yeah, I'd love to hear more from any of you.
You know, it's funny for me working in Mauritius because at least being, you know, myself, I'm African American, I'm from Southern California, you know, in this country, if I told someone, oh, I'm a descendant of slaves, everyone would be like, oh, well, yeah, of course. You know, my racial identity is pretty unambiguous in the United States. The thing is that in Mauritius, because the enslaved population is, you know, was more diverse, and that you had people from India, Southeast Asia who were slaves, when I go, and the last chapter of my book is an oral history of this museum of slavery that the government is attempting to build on the island now in one of the buildings that still stands from this period of slavery. You know, in the interviews I was conducting, it's funny because if you listen to them, people will assume that I'm from, you know, Madagascar or something, or, you know, in Mauritius, generally people think I'm from Réunion, which is a neighboring island that belongs to France. You know, it's kind of funny because I'll ask questions and I almost have to kind of like self-identify. Oh, well, I am a descendant of slaves too from the US, you know, so that is a bit I guess odd for me, or, you know, at first it was. What led me to this line of research? I mean, I think I started out as someone who was interested in the Caribbean and in histories of slavery in the greater Caribbean, so closer to home for me. But then, you know, I really just drifted over into the Indian Ocean because I became really intellectually interested in grad school in the paradigms unfolding in the Indian Ocean, and how one thing that does frustrate me is how in the United States, discussions of slavery tend to be very nationally focused. It's all about America, where, you know, but it's like, well, slavery was transnational, and there was a slave trade happening in the Indian Ocean literally at the same time as the one in the Atlantic world. So I like, you know, I was drawn to this by an interest in expanding that conversation, but also in a way in creating this kind of transcultural solidarity, right? You know, me as someone who is a descendant of slaves, you know, I'm interested in people on the other side of the world who have that same history, but yet a different ethnic identity, you could say.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenna, for that question. Sorry, I had some trouble with my mic. And thank you, Dwight, for that response. Dwight, what I was going to say is, I know you have a class to teach, and I'm keeping an eye on the time for you because I know your class starts at a certain time. And so do you tell me, do you have time for one more question before you leave?
Yeah,
or?
I do. I have time. Oh, yeah. And it's funny. It's actually the 5 College Faculty Seminar in Art History. So it's another faculty event that's happening at 7. Yeah. So I'm sure, I don't know if I'll see any of you there, but you're welcome.
Okay. So any other questions or comments? I have a question for all of you in any order. I wonder if you could just talk briefly about how these research interests that you've been describing for us, how they may or may not cross over into your teaching. Do these become, and this relates to the question, Ezekiel, that you asked of Anna already, but I just am thinking more generally or more broadly about how you see your research in relationship to your teaching.
I mean, I guess I'll go first just because I'm leaving soon. But yeah, I mean, for me, my teaching and research really inform each other very closely. And it's funny, I didn't really realize that until a few years after teaching at Amherst for a few years. Because it's interesting to me how these questions of slavery, right, of marginalized populations, of mastery of the land and indigenous knowledge, you know, it's not, they carry over, and things, lessons from Mauritius, you find even, I mean, as far away as Uzbekistan. Like, I taught this class on the modern metropolis, and we were looking at modern architecture in Russian-controlled Uzbekistan, and the issue of the colonizer and the colonized, right? It came up again in this other part of the world. And so Yeah, I mean, teaching and research are intertwined, but in a way, I do teach Mauritius sometimes in certain classes of mine. But even going beyond, it's the thematic elements that I've noticed are the strongest. And I saw there was a question in the chat about the idea of race versus ethnicity. You know, I don't know if that was directed towards all of us, but it's funny because I said at the beginning, right, Mauritius is more, ethnicity is more of an issue than race. What I meant by that is that it's a place where skin color or even family origins is not in this necessary way determinative of who and what you are. For instance, in Mauritius, when you say that you're Indian, it doesn't mean that you necessarily phenotypically look like someone from the Indian subcontinent. It more means that you have a family history that you can trace to a specific town in India. What this means is that even people who are descendants of slaves, who are Indian descended, if they can't trace that family history in Mauritius, they're not Indian, regardless of what they look like. So, you know, and race does exist. You have white people in Mauritius. That's a bit more familiar with how we understand whiteness. But, you know, it's an overlapping system, I guess you could say. But even locally on the island, people, other than saying, oh, these people are white people, our understanding of race doesn't quite exist in the same form. So, and you know, I guess that relates to teaching in a broad way.
Thanks, Dwight.
Yeah.
I want to let you go because I know you have your other obligations. So thank you in particular.
This was really great, and I'm sorry I have to run, but you know, I'm available over email if anyone wants to continue the conversation. I like these kinds of fun things, and I've learned a lot from you, Amy, and from you, Anna. Thank you, Daryl.
And I'll say, echo Dwight and thank our other panelists, Anna and Amy, for joining us. We'll keep the room open for a little bit of informal conversation, and I want to thank all of you who came to attend this event again. Thanks so much. Great to see you all.